Today is Friday, April 25th, 2014, and this is the start of an interview with Evelyn Love at her home on Pond Street. I am Nancy Clark, interviewer for the Hopkinton Oral History Project. Evelyn moved to town when she was 4 years old in 1952 and has lived here ever since. Evelyn, what brought your family to Hopkinton?
My father was one of the original physicians at the Framingham Heart Study, and we had been living in a rental home in Natick, and they were looking for a place that was out in the country that was easy commute to Framingham. So they looked at Sherburne and they looked here, and then they fell in love with this house because it was right on the lake with all sorts of open land around it.
Yeah. Do you know anything, or what could you tell us about the history of this house? It is probably one of the oldest houses in Hopkinton.
Well, when we bought it from a Mr. Lehman, who was a stockbroker in New York, whose nephew invested heavily in Polish war bonds and lost everything in the war. So he was selling off all this land. He used to own all of this land all the way up to Winter Street, so this was his sort of hunting lodge. He owned what's now the Sweet Apples house, and that was a dairy farm. He owned what's now the O'Hare's house, and that was his horse barn where he bred and raised horses. He owned all the fields all the way up on this side and that side of the road. So when he lost everything, he started selling that off. So we bought this house.
And how much acreage did you buy with it?
We bought it with 7 acres.
Okay. That's an interesting story about the house. So what was Hopkinton like back then? What recollections about growing up here do you have that might help others visualize the town in the 1950s and 60s?
Well, when we moved here, this was a very strong community. We used to have the reunions over at the old schoolhouse, which was across the road, Bear Hill School, which had been an elementary school. I guess the initial building was actually on our land, and then they had moved it across onto that field at the corner. So when we were kids, we would have these reunions with all sorts of people who we felt were really old. There was Colonel Wood, and the Bremners, and the Naves, who were all part of that community. And we as kids just sort of didn't pay much attention to them, But so that was sort of this, always a sense that this was sort of a separate part of town compared to the rest of town. And you're out here, there was very little road traffic in the area at the time. The car might go by every half hour or so. So pretty much we played with the kids who grew up with us in the surrounding houses, and used to play baseball up in the field, or go fishing, or canoeing, or horseback riding. But pretty much we played with people right in this area.
Yeah. What do you remember about that schoolhouse? What was it like inside? And do you have any idea how long before it had stopped being a school?
It had the feeling of something that was built probably, I don't know, maybe early 1900s. It was one big space, and then there was a front area where there was an old cast iron stove, and the open space had a big fireplace with interesting rocks in it, and it had a hardwood floor. That's about all that was in the open space. And lots of folding chairs for whenever they had a Bear Hill Association meeting.
Mm-hmm.
But it was really only used for community events.
That's a great resource for you, actually. Yeah.
I forgot to turn that off.
Do you know anyone, or did you know anyone from the neighborhood who went to the old school on School Street?
Yes, we had the Temples went there, and the Cheneys went there. So those are sort of the big families in this area. The Temples, the old graveyard down the road is a Temple graveyard. So there was a big house that we always called the haunted house, which was where Orr had grown up, and it had a fire, but it's one of those sort of Victorian houses with turrets, and we used to wander through it all over the broken staircases to get up to the third floor when we were kids.
Is that the red house that's still there? Or
Nope,
no?
that was the one, it's in the house sort of down the hill from the red house.
Okay, yeah.
So that was sort of Aura's, and Harry Cheney, that was Harry Cheney's house. Harry was Aura's father. And Harry Cheney, when we knew Harry, he used to be a very sort of Renaissance man sort of person. He had a big truck farm up there, so he had dozens of kinds of fancy apples all through the fields on both sides of the road.
Mm-hmm.
And he exported flowers and apples to various markets. He also made violins, so we had a carved violin that Aura had brought us to see. And he was famous because he was in one of those stories that was produced in the, I think it was the New Yorker, it's called, there was a book made of it called The 11 Blue Men. And it was the story of this epidemic of salmonella poisoning. And Harry actually died from that. He was up there sick in his bed, nobody knew about it. And when Aura finally came down to talk to my father about his father being sick, he already had, gangrene in his feet and that sort of thing.
Wow.
But it was famous because they tracked back the source of the salmonella. It was actually from a watermelon that they'd had a picnic, and somebody had cut some contaminated meat with a knife, and that had contaminated the watermelon, and there were a lot of people sort of sick. So it was one of those epidemiological studies that was reported back then.
And that would have been in the 50s?
Yeah, that was early. It was
You were
probably
young.
like 53 or 4.
Yeah.
Early 50s.
Well, and any old stories that you might have about Aura Cheney? When I first moved here in the mid-1980s, I remember meeting Aura, and I didn't know him that well, and then he died. But he gave me a business card once, and it said, Aura Cheney, I cane chairs and tell stories about the old days. Do you have any stories that Aura might have told?
Aura, of course, was a big part of our childhood. Aura was sort of a neighborhood person. He spent a lot of time with different families. He had sort of different rituals with each family. And he used to come down here at least once a day, every day, from my entire childhood and adulthood, for that matter. And he took us all over the place looking for Indian graves. We spent a lot of time digging up probably the old lumps left from the hurricane of '38.
Yeah.
And we explored old cellar holes. And I have tapes of the stories he would tell about what it was like. And all the cellar holes up here, he said, were all from stills that blew up the houses.
Wow.
So a lot of moonshine making in this area back in those days.
Yeah.
He was a twin, so their family had, William and Aura were twins. Now William became a schizophrenic and lived in the state hospital for his entire adult life, and really only died probably about 20 years ago. And Aura was severely dyslexic, so he would write letters, and you could see they're very formulaic with a lot of reversed letters, but he knew how to fix anything, We would do things like try to get the old muffler out of a car, and he'd sit there and watch you and watch you and watch you, and you'd struggle and struggle, and when you'd finally get it done, he'd say, if you'd done it that way, it would have been really easy. He always could tell you after the fact how you should have done it.
That's interesting.
And his younger brother was Curtis, and he was supposed to be the brilliant one of the family, but he was killed in the war. So he died, I imagine, the Second World War. But he was sort of early into radios, electronics, back when he was a kid. Because Aura was born in 1908. So if Curtis was younger, it must have been the Second War. I always had the sense it was the First World War. Maybe he was older.
Yeah.
And then he had one younger sister, Vera, who lived over in Upton. And she was sort of the normal one of the family.
Interesting. Well, yeah.
But when we were kids, I was a little older when he really came into our influence, because he initially spent all his time at the Clark's house up the road. So when they got old and sort of left, then he moved down to us. And he would come He shrank a lot of our wool sweaters by doing our laundry, and he would take people all over the place. You know, the younger ones would spend a lot of wonderful days going off to the pig farm to get that white-colored chocolate, you know, the chocolate and all the outside eternal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was also the famous time when people would give him animals they found. So somebody had found this dead seal in the road, and they brought or a dead seal because he'd always talked about how wonderful seal oil was. So my younger siblings and my much more proper cousins from Lincoln were involved in rendering a seal in a big cauldron over a fire outdoors. And they spent all day. First they flensed it and took these big hunks of, you know, blubber and put them in this pot, boiled and boiled and stirred, and then he had this distilled oil that he flavored or scented with oil of wintergreen, brought it down to our house and talked about how wonderful this was. And he put it on all our riding boots, which immediately went, and he put it on my father's hands. He said, "Oh, this is the best thing for your hands." My father then went off to work, and about halfway there he began to smell of rancid seal,
Oh, no.
which was a very difficult smell to get rid of. And my cousins, of course, smelled of rancid seal, and I'm sure their proper English mother was very unhappy.
Oh, that's interesting, though. Thank you for sharing some of the Cheney stories, because I know that's a famous family here. And before we get back to your own family, you also mentioned the Temples. Where did they live, and can you tell us anything about that old-time Hopkinton family that was old-time when you came?
Well, there was Uncle Bert, and he lived in the little house right across from the end of the causeway down at the bottom of the lake, and his sister, niece was Esther Bryant, and she lived in the house that's still there, just across, you know, on the south side of Pond Street.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was Belle Pike, and Belle Pike owned the house on the right, and she ran a boat livery. And all of my brothers were always boat boys, so they would go down and clean out her boats and get them ready for everybody to rent them. And she would, again, tell wonderful stories about her past. She had run off, her son was Lloyd Temple, and when he was just a baby, when she married when she was supposedly 14, and then she ran off with Pike. And Pike was a guy who made hair tonic, and this wonderful thing. They went off of all these, wherever he would sell hair tonic, and she ran off with him and went off for years. Then finally Aunt came back and ended up living in that house for years, and then when she really got old, she died when she was 103, Lloyd came back and took care of her, even though it was in the sense he never quite forgave her for running off when he was a little kid.
And you said this was Belle Pike.
Belle Pike.
Belle Pike.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. But we always spent a lot of time down there. She always made fresh bread and an old cast iron stove, and she had a famous outhouse that was entirely, the walls were papered with pictures of babies. So you'd walk in there and use her outhouse, be surrounded by little babies cut out from magazines.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And she rented boats on Lake Whitehall.
On Whitehall. Mm-hmm.
Right. That's something we don't have anymore.
Nope.
Rentals. Yeah, interesting.
Hers were green hers were green and white, and the Andersons had the other boat livery. Theirs were red and gray. So
And that was
competing
at
boat liveries.
at this end of the lake
Those are both
also,
at the
at
south
the
end of
both
the
at the
lake,
south
yeah.
end of the lake. Interesting. Wow. So back to your family. I think you had a number of siblings.
Mm-hmm.
What did you and your siblings? You said you played with a lot of the neighbors. Who were the neighbors that you played with?
We played with the Clarks and the Gillettes.
Mm-hmm.
So the Clarks lived basically next door, and they had Nancy, Bob, and Mary Clark.
Not me.
Not you.
Yeah.
Nope. So they all either babysat for us, or in fact, they all babysat for us at some point. And then we would also do things like go off fishing together, and sometimes that if their family went away, one of them would stay here because they didn't want to go.
Yeah.
So we were very close. And then across the street from them were the Gillettes. So that was Jane Gillette. The oldest was Sonny. I think he was Louis Jr. And there was Jane, then Judy, who worked up at the town hall for a long time. She must have worked there most of her life.
Mm-hmm.
And then Carol, who became a stewardess, and then the youngest was Bobby. So Bobby was the same age as my younger siblings, and Carol was a year older than I was. So again, Jane was another babysitter.
Yeah. So the Gillettes lived in the White House on the other side of the
It
fields?
red. It was red in those days.
Okay, all right, but
Yep, that
where
was their
Kathy
house.
lives, yeah.
Mhm.
And the Clarks were across the street.
Where the Pages.
The Pages live, right, yeah.
The Clarks lived in the house where Ron and Kathy lived.
Oh, okay, all right, I see. Okay, interesting. And so school, tell us about when you were in school. What schools did Hopkinton have? And
When I was in school, they had center school, and I was in center school until 6th grade. And when I hit 6th grade, they just sort of opened the 6th grade wing up at the high school, what's now the middle school. So I was in that school from 6th through 12th grade. So,
and you remember like how many kids your age there were? Do you remember how many sections of each grade?
Yeah, I think there were 4 sections per grade, and there were
Yeah.
92 in my graduating class.
Yeah. So that was pretty sizable. And that would have been in the 60s. Yeah.
That first post-war baby boom thing.
Right. And anything about, what you did in school? Who else did you meet? Kids from other side of town? You said that this Bear Hill area was sort of a unique community. Did you meet kids from other parts of town?
When you're in a big family.
How big was your family?
I had 7 siblings.
Okay. Yeah.
And there's only 10 years spread between me and I'm the oldest and the youngest. So you're such sort of there's this critical mass. And I was always a bit of a loner anyway. So basically, I studied.
Yeah.
I read, I studied.
Yeah.
I did plays.
So there was opportunity to do some plays. And, yeah.
Chorus.
Do you remember any of your teachers from back
Miss
then?
Harris was, of course, the most famous. She was always supposed to be this frightful person, but she was actually wonderful.
And this is Marion T. Harris,
Yes,
right?
that's the one.
Mm-hmm.
I always loved her class because there was always discipline in that class, and I did not enjoy lack of discipline.
Yeah.
I know. And then, of course, Mr. Doyle, he was math. So he always spent the first half hour of every class discussing town gossip, which I found very distressing.
Well, that tells you a little something about Hopkinton of old. It was small enough that...
Yes,
Mhm.
yes. And we had the same English teacher from 8th through 12th grade. We had, goodness, I'm blocking his name right now. He liked our class, and he was the head of the department, Mr. Hayes.
Okay.
So he sort of made sure we were his class.
Yeah.
So I had Mr. Doyle for 4 years. I had him for 5 years, and I had Miss Harris for 2 years, and Mr. Bento, he taught us physics. And then the Davises. The Davises were biology and civics.
Yeah.
So Bob Davis taught physics, and he was new, straight out of college, so he really taught a very interesting class. He hadn't given up on people yet, so we studied things like, Plato, and he had us read Plato and
Nice.
and things like that, which was great.
Yeah.
And I can remember in biology, DNA was not in the book yet. So I can remember him on the board explaining about this new genetic material and how it worked and all of the bases, and he had to write it out all on the board because we had no written material about it.
Yeah. Interesting. And did most of those teachers that you had in Hopkinton live in Hopkinton, do you think? Or many of them?
Mr. Hayes did, Mr. Doyle did, Miss Harris lived in Lunenburg.
Wow. It's a good distance to
It
come.
was a bit of a distance. Bob Davis for a while actually lived up in the house up the road, or no, yeah, it was Bob. He rented that house that's now the Sweet Apples house for a while.
Mm-hmm. And was his brother Roy?
Ray.
Ray,
So it was Ray and Bob.
Yeah.
So
Interesting. And you're in an interesting position because you grew up here in this house and then stayed in this house, and your children grew up here. And do you have any comments? What do you think they'd say was sort of different or was a lot the same in their experience growing up in Hopkinton, a generation apart from you?
Haven't thought of that one. Well, obviously, they sort of were the second big bump in school-age kids. So when Amanda was in school, her class was really about the same size as mine, but it was that beginning of when the classes got a lot
The growth.
larger.
Right.
And she was also the class that was first affected by school choice. So when she was in 6th grade, and they went through Elmwood School, so when she was leaving Elmwood for the junior high, a lot of her class departed for what they thought were better schools at the time. There was a lot of unrest in the school department back then because there were big budget crunches and there were pink slips given to all sorts of people that were usually the young teachers that everybody really liked. So the sense of gloom and doom, and I can remember the sense that Holliston was courting all of our kids and
Yeah.
bringing them over there. So that was the major unrest at that point. And then after that, again, the school got bigger. There were more kids, so that by the time Jojo was in school, her classes were over, they were like 240, I think, in her class. And then John's, I'm not even sure how big his was, because he just sort of rejected school.
Well, he's turned out well, I know that. So did your children, to your knowledge, have any of the teachers that you had?
I doubt it.
Did you have Mr. Fleming?
Yes. Well, no, I didn't. My younger siblings did.
All right.
So he came when my twin sisters were in, I believe, probably 9th grade. He was their counselor, or whatever they call those people, advisor, right?
Yeah.
Class advisor.
Okay.
So he and Barry Allman came about that same time.
So they would have known your family,
Oh,
and
yeah,
then they
when we
had
were
your
When
children.
we were kids, we always had teachers' parties every year. So every spring, we would invite every kid's teacher to a big cookout here. And then we'd go out, go canoeing and play baseball and have hamburgers and that sort of thing, go swimming. So we knew a lot of those teachers sort of on a little bit of a more personal basis, perhaps, than some people.
Yeah.
So.
And then by the time your children were in school, no inviting the teachers over?
Well, it got to be too hard because they had, there wasn't just one teacher per person anymore,
Right.
and there's also, the school was bigger. So we did do it when they were in elementary school, but by the time they hit middle school, each kid has 6 teachers. And you also have the sense that it might be just more of a problem for teachers rather than a benefit because they were so busy.
Mm-hmm.
We usually do it in the end of the year, and you always just had the sense that they had too much going on anyway.
So life got a little more complicated. And
Yeah.
That's interesting. And I wonder if did you sense that your kids would have liked to have done it still, or do you think that?
Oh, they probably would have, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We did have some, because I can remember having even some of the high school teachers over. I certainly remember having Miss McGonigal over and people like that. So we obviously were still doing it when Amanda was in.
Well, it's a nice
grade.
tradition. I'm sure
Yeah.
having been a teacher myself, I'm sure they appreciated that. Yeah. Yeah, that's nice. And I do know when my daughter, who was about Amanda's age, was in school, Mr. Allman invited her class out to his house at the end of the school year. So it's nice to see that attachment.
Mhm.
Which I guess sometimes you only see in a small town.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Anything you can remember from your youth about town celebrations, Hopkinton traditions that you enjoyed? Maybe starting with the marathon or anything else that may still be going on, but the town may not celebrate anymore, and whether it was a part of your.
I said we were Bear Hill people.
Yeah.
We didn't go uptown much.
That's interesting.
We had our family tradition for the 4th of July was in Lincoln, because that was where my mother had grown up, and that's where all my cousins were. So we went to Lincoln for the 4th of July. I've never been to a horribles parade in my life.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
So no, I didn't really do town things.
Was the marathon a big deal for you?
We used to go once in a while. We were very good friends with the Dodsons and Carol Dodson, Graham Spengler. Had parties, of course, every year. And we did that more when our kids were little. When we were little, the marathon was no big deal. You know, you'd go up there and say, "Well, I go a few people." It would be dozens of people, not hundreds, and certainly not thousands of people. I mean, you know, you sort of might watch it, but didn't usually bother.
Right, that's interesting. And then this year there were 36,000.
That's right.
Just happened this week.
So it's definitely it got much, much bigger by the time my kids were little. Of course, my kids all played in the band, right? So we always had to go because we had to bring them up to the band.
Yeah.
And they had years' worth of fashionable yet reflective jackets to prove it.
Yes,
All
we
those.
had those too.
You have some of those for, yes. So they would go up and play, and then we would go and spend time up at the Dodson house until probably late in the day and have cookout there.
And this was the Dodson House on Main Street?
Yeah,
on
that's
East Main Street?
There's Carol's, yeah, that's at the bottom of the hill, so you get down there. And in the old days, it used to be great because they didn't limit how fast they could go. You know, you watch those wheelchairs; they really zip down that hill.
Yeah.
Until they had that accident where they ran into a rope, and they wouldn't let them go fast anymore.
Yeah.
Made it less exciting.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So you said you were Bear Hill people and you didn't go uptown that much. When you were a teenager, I've heard there were the what is today? I don't know if it's 1 Ash Street, but it used to be the PIA building, and now I guess it's the BAA house right there on the corner across from the Doughboy. That there was a gym in there, and there used to be dances. Did you ever go to those, you and your siblings? Or?
I was not a social person.
Okay. All
I
right.
went to as few things like that as possible.
It's possible, yeah. And you mostly just did things with people around here. Yeah. How about your parents? What do you remember about, you know, if you can maybe share, they're not here to tell us, but I did know both of your parents from when I first moved in, about their experience in Hopkinton, and, you know, were they pleased after they moved here? Were they friendly with the other parents around here? What did they do?
Well, my father, again, I said he started the Framingham Heart Study, but he also had, for a few years, he had a private practice uptown. He had a memorable time when some guy who was really drunk called up and said he needed to be stitched up, and I can remember him coming down here and laying on that table, and he had been in a fight and somebody had hit him with a glass bottle and they sliced his mouth from here to here.
Oh.
So Dad said, "Yeah, you need to stitches." The guy said, "Oh no," and I can remember bringing him down to the bathroom and having him say, "Now open your mouth," and the guy opened his mouth and almost passed out when he saw what happened. So he lay him out on the table with all these little kids watching, and he started on the inside and sutured all the way outside and then sutured all the way up to the ear again. And then he told him, "Now keep your mouth shut." And the guy came back a week later, and he had 2 stitches holding here, and this whole thing was open. And he said, "You didn't keep your mouth shut," he said. So he stuck them together with Band-Aids. He said, "This time," I said, "you got to keep your mouth shut." So he sat there waiting to hear from some lawyer that he was being sued about this guy, and didn't hear anything from him. He said he saw him years later, and the thing had healed up beautifully.
You learned the second time around.
Yeah. So that was one of the more memorable doctor visits we had at this house. But then he opened a practice in Framingham, so he was very involved in he was the last unpaid everything. He was the last unpaid chief of staff, the last unpaid director of medicine. You know, he was very involved in the sort of administration of the hospital down in Framingham. My mother was big in the school committee. She was on the school committee for years. And her biggest social things, she had Kitty Group. And Kitty Group consisted of, you know, those 1950s well-educated women who didn't have jobs. So they would spend hours together just talking and letting the kids play together. It was, again, mostly my younger siblings. I was always a little on the older end, and so I wasn't as involved with the kids. But so that group was Sue DiGisaldi and Lynn Jackson and Ann Zedek and Barbara Gray and Mrs. Fletcher. So that was one of her groups. And then the other group was Bridge Club, and that was Mrs. Dodson, Mrs. Mezet, Mrs. Studley, and sometimes Mrs. Jackson. Mrs. Jackson sort of was an extra on that one. Yeah. And she sang in the chorus, so she started singing down in Framingham. It was her one outlet, escape from us when we were kids. So she used to sing in Framingham initially with Dr. Gilday, and then with John Oliver, who then became the director of the chorus out in Tanglewood and with the Boston Symphony. So from the 60s on, she sang with the Boston Symphony.
Oh, that's wonderful. And your mother's first name was?
Dorothy.
Dorothy. All right. And your father? Donald.
Donald.
Dr. Donald. Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah. And I know your mother loved to garden.
Yes.
When I moved here, she was always beautiful flowers. You do too. She was great. Well, that's really interesting. So I'm trying to see what we haven't talked about too much. So having lived here just about your whole life, from 1952 until now we're in 2014, what would you say about changes in Hopkinton? What's changed the most? Do you think changes are positive, negative? To what you attribute changes in Hopkinton? There's so many people that have just moved in the last decade or two that don't know the old place at all.
I would say that's the biggest change. A lot of new houses, a lot of much more transient families, people that come and go. Back in the old days, most people had been there for generations. We were considered newcomers. So, and it was sort of a much more blue-collar community than in those days. None of the big expensive houses that there are now. So, and of course, very little traffic. I mean, the total population of Hopkinton was about 7,000 when I was growing up. Mm-hmm. And the biggest change probably was 495, because that made all of the, made Boston accessible, made it so that this became a bedroom community for all sorts of things. And when we were kids, probably, people would work at factories in maybe Framingham or Milford. There was no one particular town that was sort of this, associated, I wouldn't say. But
yeah, no, a lot of commuting to a big city, yeah.
A lot of what I would consider much more privileged people than we used to be.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And is there still a network of, some of the friends that you had growing up? I'm sure many of them moved away, but are there still a sizable number of people that lived here and grew up when you did? And do those people still get together?
Well, we get together with the DiGisaldis. We have Christmas caroling every year.
Where do you Christmas carol?
At the DiGisaldis' house over on Franklin Road. So we go over there and sing. Nice. Lucy plays a very out-of-tune piano and, sing.
Nice.
We've done that for many, many years.
It's a great tradition. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I would say that the Braults were also a big part of our family.
The Braults on East Main Street, yeah. Richard?
Largely because they were into music and we were into music, and we belonged to a community. It's called Community Concerts Association, which was the most incredible deal when you had a large family. There was a family rate, and it was very low, and you could go to up to 50 concerts for that one rate. And as many people were in your family could go to as many concerts as you wanted to. So we were based in the Framingham one. So we would go, there were 4 concerts at Framingham, but we could go to Franklin, we could go to Worcester, we could go to all the towns that were involved. And, we saw fantastic people. We saw people like Rostropovich, and people sat on stage with him. We saw famous opera singers like Richard Tucker. We saw the Trapp family singers.
Oh, wow.
We saw all of these, Theodore Bickel, and famous pianists, Thomas Vachery, just wonderful, wonderful performers. You know, and often Ann Zedek was very much involved in music as well, so she would, if the pianist, all of her kids played piano, so she would often invite them back to her house, and then we would go back and have an evening with these famous musicians as well. So that was another part of our experience back
Sounds
then.
wonderful.
It was incredible.
And I know today, does your husband still play with the Metro Symphony?
He plays with Metro Symphony. Yeah. My kids played, my siblings played with the Framingham Community Concerts. It was Framingham Community Orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of the violinists from Boston Symphony who sort of started that. He was the initial conductor, and Debbie, John, Judy, and Jan all played in that orchestra growing up with Mr. Markarian. Now, Mr. Markarian was the head of the music department in those days, and he was wonderful, and he believed in string players.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had a lot of violins, and so that was a big part of their childhood, was being in that orchestra, and he was sort of the one that got them into it.
Yeah.
He played too, so he would go and they would go.
Wonderful. Yeah, I know there's a Markarian Music Scholarship that's given every year at the high school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He always came to our parties.
That's wonderful. Yeah, so many fascinating people. Great stories. Is there anything else that you can think of that you want to share? Whether, family stories, old Hopkinton stories, neighborhood, Bear Hill, anything else that you want to mention that you haven't yet? Well, Evelyn, thank you so much for the great stories that you told. I live on Bear Hill myself, on School Street, and I've learned a lot about the area from you. I appreciate your time. And this is the end of the April 25th, 2014 interview with Evelyn Love. The interviewer was Nancy Clark.